right. This is our, I don't know, 10th week in Hebrews chapter 11. Okay, and today, as has been the case the past few weeks, we get one verse. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. Again, no guarantee that the sermon will be short, okay, just because there's one verse. Verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Let me read it again. All right? By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So if you were with us last week, we talked about how the Israelites had settled into Egypt, but specifically they settled in this sort of suburb of Egypt, northern part of the Nile, called Goshen. And Goshen became a place where they became very fruitful. They multiplied, just things were working out for them. It became this nice little enclave, this gated community, this place that was really thriving. So then what happens is generation after generation, the Israelites continue to thrive in Goshen, and a new king comes, and this king had no idea of the history of how they got there, who they were, didn't understand who Joseph was, and that whole story was lost to history to this king. So here's what it says in Exodus chapter 1, verse 9. It says, "And he said to the people," this is the king, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." So what the king does is he makes a geopolitical decision, because this thriving people happen to be in the part of Egypt that is right next to Canaan. And so what's the king's fear? The king's fear is this, that if war breaks out between us and Canaan, because they're next to Canaan, because their heritage comes from Canaan, they might join sides with them against us. So he has to make a strategic choice, right? There's these people that are thriving, but they're located in a way, and their history is in a way that it could jeopardize us as a nation. And so he decides to oppress them. But the more he oppresses them, the more they multiply. He can't stop God's work of blessing, right? God's promise is in action right here, where he says that your descendants will be like the stars of the sky. They're starting to multiply. So here's what the king decides in verse 15. "So the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of who was named Shipra and the other Puah." Okay, now these were Egyptians assigned to be midwives, not Hebrews. These were Egyptians assigned to be midwives. Verse 16, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live." Verse 17, "But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live." Okay, so now that puts us where our passage in Hebrews chapter 11 landed, where one of the beneficiaries to the midwives not obeying the king was Moses. Okay, so Moses was born, and instead of following what the king said, in some way he was spared. So here's the story of Moses in Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 1. "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months." How do you do that? Right? Like, I don't know, just thinking through if I was them, if you've ever had a 1-month-old, 2-month-old, 3-month-old, it's pretty hard to hide them, right? There's no soundproofing there. I guess, I don't know what they did. Maybe they pretended the son was a daughter? I don't know, but that would be very difficult and scary and stressful if you're telling me I have to hide this crying baby from the authorities lest they take him away, right? So verse 3, "When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river. And the sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Coincidence? I don't know. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." That's awesome, right? You get paid to feed your own child, if only that were the case. So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water," right? And so what I want us to understand is that the decision that Moses' mother made and the way in which she enacted the decision was actually very wise and strategic, right? So she puts him in this basket. In Hebrew, the word is actually not basket. Anyone know what it actually is? Ark. It's actually ark, right? Isn't that beautiful, right? Like ark, that would get our minds to go back to Noah, where there was this wooden vessel that saved humanity, right, from the water. Same thing here. There's this wooden vessel that is saving Moses from the water. It's kind of beautiful, right? But the reason why it was strategic and calculated is because they did this on a day and a time where they knew that Pharaoh's daughters were going to be bathing in the river. This was like a regular thing. It wasn't like they decided, "Oh, I'll bathe now." It was no. Pharaoh's daughters would be bathing by the river. So it's very calculated. They knew somebody would be in the river at the time where I set this plan in motion. Secondly, that area where the daughter would bathe was surrounded by reeds. So there are reeds separating it from the rest of the Nile for a few reasons. One of the reasons being that it separated that area from the rest of the river for ceremonial washings, but also it was a way to actually keep out crocodiles from that area. Smart, right? So the mom knew that there was going to be somebody there, and the mom also knew that this was an area that was separated away from danger. Because if she just set it sail, what could have happened? That baby could be gone down the Nile, right? Like forget it, all the way to Syria or wherever. But she thought carefully about when to do it and how to do it. And this is not the main point, but all I want us to see here is this incident is an incident of faith, but it's actually an incident where human planning and human wisdom collided with God's provision and purpose. Human wisdom and human planning intersected with God's provision and purpose. I'll amen that. Okay, fine. Nobody else thinks that's awesome. Okay, that's fine. The Holy Spirit is still working in you, right? That's why as we've been talking about this idea of faith, one aspect of faith is we got to act. We got to act. We got to do something. We got to take what we have and offer it before God and move on it, even if at times we're not sure. We're not called to just passively wait and we pray and we pray and we passively wait. Part of faith is actually taking what we know, taking what we have, acting on it, and watch as God uses that and intersects it with his purpose and provision. That is one aspect of faith that I think we need to understand. So if you're like praying for something, I don't know, like a job or a relationship or whatever it is, right? I think there are times where we pray for something and God is asking us, just hold on and wait and trust me. But I think there are other times where God is saying, what are you doing? Get up. Get up. Right? You've lain down long enough. You've prayed before me long enough. Get up and watch what I can do with your faith in action. Man's wisdom, man's planning, there are times where that intersects with, and God uses that with his purpose and provision. I also want us to realize, like even in exile, even in suffering, like the Jewish people were suffering, right? But even in exile and even in suffering, God was working. I mean, think about this. These are Egyptian midwives, given a command to do one thing, and yet somehow these Egyptian midwives came to know and fear God enough to disobey what they were supposed to do. God was working. And then later on, we see what? Pharaoh's daughter, who was probably trained her whole life to mistrust and if not hate the Hebrew people, God changed her heart enough to want to take care of this baby and bring it into Pharaoh's household. I just want you to know, like, there are going to be times where it seems like we're oppressed or things are falling apart, but God's working. God is setting up these moments and these intersections where our faithfulness and our obedience are going to start to intersect with his provision and purpose. God is working. So last week, the question that we answered was sort of a morbid one. It was this question of how does our faith inform our view of what happens after we die? Right? Not a very popular topic. How does our faith inform our view of what happens after we die? Today, I want to actually ask this question, is how faith informs our choices in situations that sometimes don't have a clear answer, or situations that sometimes seem to contradict God's laws or what we know about God. How does our faith inform how we act in situations that don't have a clear answer or in situations that seem to contradict what we know or think about God? And specifically in this story, what I want us to see is the midwives were blessed because they lied. Isn't that weird? God blessed the midwives because they lied. Exodus chapter 1, verse 18. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this, and let the male children live?" 19. The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives comes to them." So they're fast, right? Labor for them is like, oh, that was easy, right? And we can't even get there in time to do what you're asking us to do. They lied. That wasn't true. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, look at this, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." They were blessed because they lied. Isn't that confusing? Because that begs the question for us, when should we lie? Right? When should we lie? And Moses' parents, too, disobeyed the government, who said, any male born, this should be what happens, but every female can live. So that begs the question for us, in what way should we disobey the government? In what way should we practice civil disobedience? And what does that even look like? Okay, so here's how we're going to approach this. Are you ready? Here's the plan. Whether it works or not, it's not up to me, I guess. We're going to look at this very specific situation, okay? And then we're going to extend that to a bigger biblical principle, and then we're going to try to see how that hits home to us in general. Okay, so we'll start very small in the micro, and then we'll try to grow the idea here, right? So how can we discern through our faith how to make decisions when either those decisions are unclear or seem to contradict things that God has commanded us to do, right? That's the question we're going to wrestle with. Is everybody okay with that? Okay, one person's okay with that. Adrian, I will only make eye contact with you for the rest of the service. The rest of you, I will just pretend like you're nodding, okay? All right, so where was I? I lost track. Okay, here we go. Here's the problem. Romans 13, verse 1. Here's what Paul says, okay? Let me warn you ahead of time. This is a very easy argument, but it'll get more complex. Verse 13, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, including the king of Egypt, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath and wrongdoer." So what's Paul saying? Obey authority. Now here's what's interesting about that. The authority that Paul was addressing was not necessarily nice people. The authority that Paul experienced was not nice people supportive of Christians. The authority that Paul was experiencing in his lifetime was actually very much authority that was against Christians, that was persecuting Christians, that was making things illegal. They were making it illegal to be a Christian. They were killing Christians. That's the authority. So when Paul is saying you got to obey authority, in his mind, he's not saying obey good authority. In his experience, he's actually experiencing very evil authority. And so he's not, in this point, necessarily making a distinction, but he's saying we have to be subject to the governing authorities because, guess what? God was the one that put them there. And it's not our job to decide whether or not to follow that authority. That's what it seems to be he's saying, right? In the bigger context, what he's really getting at is Christians, that's us, we should actually be model citizens. We should be model citizens above reproach so that when people look at us, they don't see annoying, irritating, countercultural people that, just always want to do the opposite, but what they see in us is actually Christ. That's the call. Let's be good citizens. And furthermore, trust God's timing. Trust God's timing to remove the evil authority on his time. That's the context. So now, let's bring it to us. Let me ask again, when should we resist authority? Or to how far should we take this? How far should we give ourselves sort of the justification that it's okay to lie in the situation? Your spouse or significant other asks you, do I look good in this outfit? And you have one thought, but you know that thought will lead to conflict. Do you lie? I don't know. Okay? My significant other always looks good, so I got no problems. Okay? Also, the context is about being good citizens. If you actually look at Romans 12, the context is also about this nonviolence. So the idea being, if you are going to practice civil disobedience, it should be in a nonviolent way. Okay? So under what situation should we go against the principle that Paul says every person should be subject to governing authorities? So, I looked that up in commentaries and websites, and they sort of had a list of if this is the case, then don't obey authority. But I want to tell you up front, some of it's really obvious to the point where I was like, anyone with a brain would understand this. But I'm going to show you anyway, because some of it actually is areas that we might struggle with, okay? So here are the 4 ways, according to biblical experts, that we ought to consider not obeying authority. Can we put up the 4 ways? Okay, so the first one, if obedience would involve immorality. That's like a duh situation, right? These midwives are said, hey, kill these babies. Obviously, that's immoral. You don't want to do that. Or if you actually look at a story in 1 Samuel, Saul, during a battle, says, if anyone eats before this battle is done, they will be put to death. Guess who ate? Anyone remember? Adrian? Jonathan, his son, ate some honey. So now, Saul said, hey, if anyone eats, they got to die. So what's got to happen? Jonathan has to die. So Saul says to the people, Jonathan has to die. So what did the people do? They disobeyed authority because they knew it was immoral, and they actually advocated for him, and it said redeemed him or saved him in a sense. Right? So that's pretty obvious. Same thing here. Midwives kill these babies. That's immoral. I'm going to disobey authority. Second one is if obedience would involve abuse of power. That's a little more subtle. I actually struggled with what this meant. The main examples were, if you've anyone ever read Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom? So Corrie ten Boom, I think they lived in Holland or somewhere during the Nazi occupation, and what their family did is they hid Jews. So every time the German authorities would come say, are there Jewish people in your house? What would they say? No, that was a lie, right? Because to submit to the authority and say yes at that point would allow the authority to abuse their power in a way that was ungodly. So that one, I think, maybe is a little bit obvious too, but I could think of some situations, maybe in your workplace, boss tells you to do something. In your mind, it feels like this is them abusing their power. Is it okay? Do you obey? Is it a big deal? Should you even fight it? Right? Boss asked you to pick up their dry cleaning. I don't know. Should you do that? I don't know. Sort of a gray area, right? Third, if obedience involves idolatry, right? Again, I would say obvious. You read all of Daniel. Daniel stood up to authority that told him to only pray to this God. Okay? And Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego also stood up to the decree that said you shall worship this God. So I think that's pretty clear. Verse 4, if obedience would involve silencing the gospel. So if we are in a situation where obeying the authority would result in us actually preventing us from sharing the gospel, then maybe we should consider disobeying. So during the time of Paul, here were the laws. So this was from Cicero. Some of you might have heard that. And here is the law. No person shall have any separate gods or new ones, nor shall he privately worship any strange gods unless they be publicly allowed. So to Romans, who was God? Caesar, in a sense, right? Okay? And so that was the law. But if you obey this law, that cuts off any chance for people to hear the gospel. So who broke this law? Paul. Right? He was jailed several times because he would not obey this law. But yet he tells us you should be subject to authority. Right? So I think this one is a little bit more obvious, but also there could be some gray areas where you would ask, is this choice silencing the gospel or not? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. So John Stott kind of summarizes these ideas in this way. He said, if the state commands what God forbids or forbid what God commands, then our plain Christian duty is to resist, not to submit, to disobey the state in order to obey God. But I still feel, I don't know how you feel, those things were pretty obvious. Like, I don't need to tell you to disobey authority if it means committing something immoral or if it means silencing the gospel. Those seem pretty obvious. But what about issues that are more complex and are less obvious? Think about the Hebrew readers. The Hebrew readers were living their life, practicing their religion and beliefs just fine. Just fine. And then this law comes down from Rome that says what you're doing is illegal. So put it in our context. Let's say we're meeting at church and all of a sudden the Taiwan government says Christianity is banned. So what we're doing is illegal. Should we continue to meet as a church? Some say yes, some say no. Think about if you're a Hebrew and you're a parent. If you get caught, your house could be taken away and you could be put in jail away from your family. Do you still practice your belief system if the choice you make could end up costing your family dearly? Your family who God has entrusted into your hands. Do you do it? I don't know what I would do in that situation, to be honest. Or who's ever seen the movie Silence with Andrew Garfield by Francis Ford Coppola? Anyone know what it is? It was filmed in Taiwan. What? So the movie Silence has to do with these Jesuit priests in Japan. Oh, so now you know, right? Okay. And long story short, Japan was persecuting Christians for preaching the gospel, and they were making them step on like a statue, a picture of Jesus' face as a way to say, I renounce my faith. And one of the scenes, full disclosure, I haven't watched the movie because I don't like movies that involve a lot of mud, and that movie seemed very muddy, okay? So, I don't know, it's just a thing. I don't want to watch movies where there's a lot of mud. It just really disturbs me. Maybe it's from my childhood or watching that traumatic scene from Never-Ending Story with the horse. I don't know. Okay, so I don't like movies with mud, okay? But anyway, let me get back to this. So one of the last scenes in the movie, Andrew Garfield, who plays a Jesuit priest, sees these 5 men being tortured. And he thinks they're being tortured because they believe in Jesus. But what he finds out is no, they've actually already recounted. They've already said, I give up my faith. They're being tortured because you believe in Jesus, Andrew Garfield, Spider-Man. And so now you have a choice. If you renounce your faith, then we'll stop the torture. But if you keep your faith, then we'll keep going. They might die. What do you do? Right? Again, that's pretty extreme. But it's a situation where I can't be like, let me see what the Bible says. Okay, if 5 people are being tortured, then yes. If 4 people are being tortured, then negotiate. There's nowhere in the Bible where you're going to find that answer to that question. But there are principles in the Bible that you can use to help guide your decision in that situation. And I actually love the Bible for its contradictions. I love it for its contradictions. Like in 1 Peter, Peter says, obey, you got to obey authority. And then in Acts 5, Peter says, you got to obey God, not man. It's like, what, Peter? What are you going to, I don't understand. You're telling me to obey authority? You're telling me, no, don't obey authority. I love the contradictions because what the contradictions in the Bible or the gray areas in the Bible do is they invite us to wrestle with the application of God's truth and how our faith is to be lived out. That's the invitation. There are some truths in the Bible that are true in every situation. Don't get me wrong. There are certain truths that it applies all the time. Those biblical principles are solid. You know exactly what to do. But there are other principles in the Bible that call us to live out our faith. But I feel like the living out of that faith or that principle could vary greatly depending on the situation and depending on the person. And I don't know if that makes you uncomfortable. And please hear me. I'm not saying you get to interpret the Bible in whatever convenient way you want. I'm just saying there is ambiguity in the Bible just as there's ambiguity in life so that you and I could wrestle with it. Because even when some things are clear, how it's lived out can vary. So here's why I think that's actually good. Because sometimes what we expect from God is, God, just tell me what to do. God, just tell me what to do. I'm confused. I don't know what to do in this situation. God, just tell me what to do. And sometimes the Bible is clear. But more often than not, God is not telling us what to do. You know what he's doing? He's changing our hearts so that we are empowered to do what we should do, and so that we also will naturally gravitate towards a path that involves doing what we should be doing. Where it's like, God, give me answers. God's saying, no, I'm not going to give you answers. I'm going to change your heart. I'm going to change your life. So what we're invited to is not mastering a list of if-thens. We're not invited into some scholarly study of which commandments are greater than other commandments, or what the definition of lying is, or murder. That's all good. I'm not saying that's bad, but we're not invited into mastering if-thens. The Bible is inviting us into a relationship with a personality who, once we get to know that personality, we will naturally know how to react to a situation. Because you know what? All the biblical principles and all the biblical rules flow out of this personality of God. And so what the Bible is saying, don't get to know a list of commands, only get to know the person who you are called to be more and more like. Because once you know a person, you don't have to ask, what's the rule? Once you know a person deeply, I've said this before, you don't have to ask, what do they like? And so these gray areas in our life are awesome, even if they're frustrating and even if they're scary, because they are opportunities for us to wrestle with God in prayer. And instead of finding an answer, finding a person, and that relationship is what guides us, not some recipe of what to do and what to follow. To wrestle with God in prayer and to wrestle with each other as well, lest you go off the rails. So let me give you an example from my life. There came a decision 13 years ago when God opened up an opportunity to come to Taiwan, and I might have shared this before. Come to Taiwan, okay? Unfortunately, there is no verse that says, thou shalt go to Taiwan, okay? There should be. It's a great place. But there's no verse. So should I go? Yeah, I mean, take the world to all nations, or, whatever. Or should I stay? I mean, yeah, you could also find principles and verses and ideas where, yeah, I should stay. So what did I do? I wrestled. I sought counsel from friends, because if I wrestle in isolation, that's bad. If you ever know people that wrestle in isolation and just sort of come up with their own theology and philosophy, that is very dangerous. So I asked my friend. One of my best friends says, yeah, you should go. It's an awesome opportunity. Ask my other friend, no, are you crazy? You can't go to Taiwan. Oh my gosh. What do I do? But it was in that wrestling. It was in that wrestling in community. It was taking what I knew and understood of God that really freed me to go. To say, yes, this is a gray area. Yes, I'm not sure. But you know what? God's opening an opportunity. I'm going to trust him. I'm going to go. Not because of a rule, but because of the relationship. Not because of a principle, but because of a relationship. Let me tell you when I really kind of came to grips with this. And a lot of this is just my opinion. So help God filter out anything that either you disagree with or is just of me, right? You know when this idea of principles and gray areas and how we should approach it really hit me was a quote that is ascribed to Mother Teresa. And I might have shared this before. And it's ascribed to her, and it's over the issue of abortion. Over the issue of abortion. And here was her take on abortion. She said, in quote, please don't kill the child. I want the child. Please give me the child. I'm willing to accept any child who would be aborted and to give that child to a married couple who will love that child and be loved by that child. From our children's home in Calcutta alone, we have saved over 3,000 children from authorities. Abortions, right? These children have brought such love and joy to their adopting parents and have grown up so full of love and joy. And when I heard that, I thought that is a very different reaction to the problem of abortion. And that is a very different way to live out faith in response to this situation. Historically, how has the church responded to this issue? It's not pretty how the church has responded to this issue. And when I heard this quote, I was just like, it blew my mind, because as a church, what do? We celebrate when a law gets passed that aligns with our values, but that law causes no heart change. So people can't do this thing that we feel they should not do, but their hearts are the same. So they find other ways to do it anyway. But the church is like, yes, we passed the law. But the law did not turn people to Jesus. Or, in fact, it probably turned people away from Jesus in some sense. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't advocate for laws to be passed, but I'm just saying in the same situation, there were different ways of applying biblical principles that when I looked at her answer, I didn't think, wow, she knows her Bible. What I thought is, wow, she knows Jesus. Because I couldn't say this, right? Are we willing to say this? Like, hey, give us the kids? I couldn't. That's very difficult for me at my current spiritual state right now. But here's a person who, in my eyes, in my opinion, saw the problem not through the lens of just these rigid biblical rules, but through those rigid biblical rules interpreted through a relationship with the person who gave them to us in the first place. It's like, wow. Like, so what if we pass a law? Muslim countries have these laws that prevent people from doing what they don't want to do. Are their hearts changed? Does God care? And I came to realize, like, yeah, our decision-making has to be biblical. Our decision-making has to be done in community. But ultimately, our decision-making, the way our faith lives up, has to also flow from a relationship with the one who wrote these truths and gave them to us. What if the church poured our resources into this? Wouldn't that change the world? Right? Like if our church or any church poured the resources into solving the problem this way, into showing Jesus to the world this way, I think that would change the world. I think that would point people to Jesus. Isn't that crazy? So here's what I want to say to just kind of wrap this up. You know, in the light of like, how are we to act in areas that seem to contradict Scripture? How are we to act in terms of government? You know, we are called to be culturally and politically subversive as a people, I agree. But first and foremost, we're called to be spiritually subversive. And so the goal of civil obedience is to draw people to Jesus and have them worship Jesus, because we show what a Christ-transformed life looks like in the context of obeying authority. And you know what? Civil disobedience, the purpose of that is also to point people to Jesus and to draw worship so that people would see a different way. All of that, everything we do needs to come from that, but we can't do that unless we are connected to, empowered from, and transformed by him. Knowing the heart of the person who these ideas and rules and principles and laws flowed from in the first place. That's what I think the midwives didn't know the Bible, right? But yet God worked in their lives to cause them to fear. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Again, if you are joining us for the first time in a while, you may be very confused. You did not manage to avoid meet and greet. You walked right into the trap. Okay, so one of the principles that is sort of guiding our programming the past few weeks is we want to take the word and take what's happened in the week and respond. And the two ways that we're responding to God is, first of all, through meeting one another, sharing, struggling together, and praying, right? That's the wrestling in community, but also worshiping God in song. Okay, so for the next 10, 15 minutes, if we could gather in groups, not yet, of three or so, okay, and just share. Are there gray areas where you're confused? Like, I don't know what to do. God is not giving me an answer. Are there areas in the past maybe where you've been confused and you're not sure? Or things that have happened in the past where you're just like, I don't understand why it happened this way and that way. Maybe share that. Okay? Are there prayer requests you have regarding areas that aren't making sense to you? Share that.